2. The Hunt. He headed southwest away from the winter that had closed in over the land. There was a stiff climb, encumbered by drifts of snow, through the mountain pass that took us to the country of the Italians. But after that, the going was easier. We travelled across a rich plain and came to a sea that beat dark and tideless against rocky shores and little fishing harbours. So southward with hills and distant mountains on our left hand until it was time to break through the heights to the west again. As peddlers we were welcomed almost everywhere, not only for the things we brought with us but as new faces in small communities, where people, whether liking or disliking them, knew their neighbours all too well. Our wares to start with were bolts of cloth and carvings and small wooden clocks from the Black Forest. Our men had captured a couple of barges trafficking along the Great River and made off with their cargoes. We sold these as we went and bought other things to sell at a further stage of our journey. Trade was good, for the most part. These were rich farming lands, the women and children anxious for novelties. The surplus, apart from what we needed to buy food, accumulated in gold and silver coins. And in most places, we were given board and lodging. In return for the hospitality we were shown, we stole their boys from them. This was a thing that I could never properly resolve in my mind. To Fritz it was simple and obvious. We had our duty, and must do it. Even apart from that, we were helping to save these people from the destruction which the masters planned. I accepted the logic, and envied him his single-mindedness. But it still troubled me. Part of the difficulty, I think, was that it fell to me more than to him to make friends with them. Fritz, as I now knew well enough, was amiable at heart, but taciturn and withdrawn in company. His command of languages was better than my own, but I did more of the talking and a lot more of the laughing. I quickly got on good terms with each new community we visited and moved on, in many cases, with real regret. Because, as I had learned during my stay in the Château de la Rouge, the fact that a man or a woman wore a cap and thought of the tripods as great metal demigods did not prevent him or her from being, in all other respects, a likeable, even lovable human being. It was my job to beguile them into accepting us and bartering with us. I did it well, I think, but would have been happier if I could have remained more detached from the purpose behind my blandishments. It was not easy to make friends with them, to recognize their many kindnesses to us and, at the same time, to pursue our objective, which was, as they would have seen it, to seek their trust only to betray it. I was often ashamed of what we did. For our concern was with the young, the boys who would be capped in the next year or so. We gained their interest in the first case by bribery, giving them small presents of knives, whistles, leather belts, things like that. They flocked around us, and we talked to them, artfully making remarks and putting queries designed to discover which of them had begun to question the right of the tripods to rule mankind, and to what extent. We rapidly grew skilled at this, developing a good eye for the rebellious, or potentially rebellious. And there were far more of these than one would have guessed. At the beginning, I had been surprised to find that Henry, whom I had known and fought with since we were both able to walk, was as eager as I to break loose from the chafing confinement of life as we knew it. As apprehensive as I was of what our elders told us was the wonderful bliss of being capped, I had not known, because one did not talk about these things. To voice doubts was unthinkable. But that did not mean that doubts did not exist. It became clear to us that doubts of some kind were in the minds of almost all those who found the capping ceremony looming up in their lives. There was an intoxicating sense of release for them in being in the presence of two who, while seeming to be capped, did not, like their parents, treat the subject as a mystery that must never be spoken of, but instead encouraged them to talk and listen to what they said. Of course, we had to be careful. It was a matter at the outset of veiled hints, inquiries seemingly innocent, whose effect depended on the look that went with them. Our procedure was to discover the one or two who in each village best combined independence of mind and reliability. Then, shortly before we moved on, these were taken to one side and briefed and counselled. We told them the truth about the tripods and the world, and of the part they must play in organising resistance. It was not a matter now of sending them back to one of our headquarters. Instead, they were to form a resistance group among other boys in the village or town and plan an escape before the next cappings. This would be long enough after our visit for there to be no suspicion that we were concerned in it. They must find places to live, well apart from the capped, but from where they could raid their lands for food and their youth for new recruits, and where they could wait for new instructions. There could be little definitely laid down. Success must depend on individual skill in improvisation and action. Some small help we could offer by way of communications. We carried pigeons with us, caged in pairs, and at intervals we left a pair with one of our recruits. These were birds that could return over vast distances to the nest from which they had come and carry messages written very small on thin paper tied to their legs. They were to be bred and their descendants used to keep the various centres in touch with each other and, eventually, with the headquarters group responsible for them. We gave them signs of identification too, a ribbon tied in a horse's mane, hats of a certain kind worn at a certain angle, a way of waving, the simulated cries of certain birds, and places nearby where messages could be left to guide us again, or our successors, to whatever hiding place they had found. Beyond that, we could do no more than leave it in the hands of Providence and go our way, further and further on the path Julius had prescribed for us. At the beginning we had seen tripods fairly frequently. As we went on, though, this happened less and less. It was not a matter of the winter making them inactive, we found, but a real effect of distance from the city. In the land called Hellas, we were told that they appeared only a few times in the year, and in the eastern parts of that country the villagers told us that the tripods came only for the capping ceremonies. And then, not to every small place, as they did in England, children were brought great distances by their parents to be capped. This was reasonable, of course. The tripods could travel fast, many times the speed of a galloping horse, and without stopping, but distance must take a toll even on them. It was inevitable that they should police those regions close to the city more thoroughly than far-off places. Each mile represented a widening of the circle of which it was the centre. For our part, it was a relief to find ourselves in territories where we could be well nigh certain, at this time of year, that no metal hemisphere on its three-jointed legs would break the skyline. And it raised a thought. There were two cities of the masters at either edge, more or less, of this vast continent. If control grew more tenuous the farther one travelled from a city, might there not be a part midway between them, where control did not exist at all, where men were uncapped and free? In fact, as we learned later, the arcs of control overlapped each other, and the area falling outside them was mostly ocean in the south and wastes of frozen land in the north. Those lands, farther to the south, which they did not control, they had laid waste. Our task did not, as one might have thought, become easier where the tripods were less common. If anything, they seemed, perhaps through their rarity, to inspire a more complete devotion. We reached a land at last beyond an isthmus between two seas, near which stood the ruins of a great city. It was relatively little overgrown with vegetation, but looked far more ancient than any other we had seen, in which there were great hemispheres of wood set on 3 stilts and approached by steps, in which the people worshipped. Long involved services were conducted there with much chanting and wailing. Above each hemisphere stood a model of a tripod, not painted gold but covered with the beaten leaf of the very metal. But we persisted and found converts there also. We were becoming more skilled at our job all the time. There were tribulations, of course, although we had moved south into sunnier, warmer lands. There were times of bitter cold, particularly in the higher regions, when we had to huddle close to the horses at night to keep the blood from freezing in our veins. And long, arid days in near desert regions, when we had to look anxiously for a sign of water, not just for ourselves, but for our beasts. We depended on them absolutely, and it was a staggering blow when Fritz's horse sickened and, a couple of days later, died. I was selfish enough to be glad that it was not my own horse, Crest, of which I was very fond, but even more concerned with the difficulties that faced us. We were in bad country too, on the edge of a great desert and a long way from habitation. We transferred as much of our baggage as possible to Crest and plodded off, walking now, of course, in the direction of the nearest village. As we went, we saw large, ugly birds drop from the lazy circles they had been making in the sky to rip the flesh from the poor creatures' bones. They would be picked clean within an hour. What they did have here was a creature such as I had never seen before, nor imagined could exist. It was covered in coarse, light brown hair and stood higher than a horse, and had a huge hump on its back, which we were told contained a store of water on which it could live for days, a week if necessary. Instead of hooves, it had great splayed feet with toes. The head, at the end of a long neck, was hideously ugly, with loose lips and big yellow teeth and, I may say, foul breath. The animal looked awkward and ungainly, but could move surprisingly fast and carry huge loads. This was in the morning. We travelled all that day and half of the next before we reached a few stone huts clustering about an oasis. There was no hope of replacing our lost animal there, and we had to trek on another 3 days to what was described as a town, though no bigger in fact than the village of Werton, where I was born. Here there were animals, and we had gold with which to pay for one. The difficulty was that horses in these parts were never used as beasts of burden, but only as gaudily comparison steeds for persons of high rank. We would have bitterly offended local custom if we had bought one and then put packs on it. Fritz and I had a disagreement in regard to this. I wanted us to purchase one of these beasts, and he opposed it. I suffered the usual frustration that took place when we were at odds over something. My passionate statement of my argument was met by stolid resistance on his part. This made me indignant. My indignation made him more sullenly obstinate, which increased my indignation further, and so on. My enumeration of the animal's advantages was answered by the simple counter that we had almost reached the point at which we should turn and start our return swing toward the caves. However useful it might be in these parts, it would look bizarre in places where it was not familiar. And the one thing we must not do was attract undue attention. It was likely, Fritz pointed out, that being accustomed to this particular climate, it might sicken and die in more northerly lands. He was, of course, quite right, but we spent 2 days wrangling before I could bring myself to admit it, and to admit, to myself at least, that it was the very bizarreness which had, in fact, in part, attracted me. I'd been envisaging myself, poor crest forgotten for the moment, riding through the streets of strange towns on the creature's swaying back, and people flocking around to stare at it. With the same amount of money, we were able to buy 2 donkeys, small but hardy and willing beasts, and loaded our goods on them. We also had enough to purchase the wares of this country, dates, various spices, silks, and finely woven carpets, which we sold very profitably later on. But we made few converts. We could buy and sell and barter in sign language, but one needed words to talk of liberty and the need to win it from those who enslaved us. Also, the cult of the tripods was far stronger here. The hemispheres were everywhere, the larger ones having a platform under the tripod figure at the top, from which a priest called the faithful to prayer 3 times a day, at dawn and noon and sunset. We bowed our heads and muttered with the rest. So we reached the river indicated on our map, a broad warm waterway which moved in sluggish serpentine coils through a green valley, and turned back toward home. The return journey was different. We took a pass through a range of mountains and came out near the eastern shore of that sea we had glimpsed from the ruined great city that stood on the isthmus. We followed it around to the north and west, making good time, and once more winning great numbers to our cause. The people spoke the Russian tongue, and we had been given some instructions in this and notes to study. We travelled north, but summer was outstripping us. The land was bright with flowers, and I recall one time when we rode all day long in the intoxicating scent of young oranges ripening on the branches of huge groves of trees. Our schedule called for us to be back at the caves before winter, and we had to press on fast to keep it. We were moving back toward the city of the masters as well, of course. From time to time we saw tripods striding across the horizon. We saw none close at hand though, and were grateful for that. None, that is, until the day of the hunt. The masters, as we had learned, treated the capped differently in different places. I do not know whether the spectacle of human variety amused them. They themselves, of course, had always been of one race, and the notion of national differences, of many individual languages, of war, which had been the curse of mankind before their conquest, was utterly strange to them. In any event, although they prohibited war, they encouraged other forms of diversity and separateness, and cooperated, to some extent, in human customs. Thus, in the capping ceremony, they followed a ritual as their slaves did, appearing at a certain time, sounding a particular dull booming call, fulfilling prescribed motions. At the tournaments in France and at the games they attended patiently throughout, though their only direct interest was in the slaves they would acquire at the end. Perhaps, as I say, this sort of thing amused them, or perhaps they felt that it fulfilled their role as gods. At any rate, we came to a strange and horrible demonstration of it when we were only a few 100 miles from our journey's end. For many days we had been following a vast river on which, as in the case of the river that had led us north to the games, much traffic plied. Where the ruins of a great city lay in our path, we detoured onto higher ground. The land was well cultivated to a large extent, with vines which had been recently stripped of grapes for the harvest. It was populated, and we stayed the night at a town that looked down towards the ruin and the river and the broad plain beyond, through which it ran into an autumn sunset. The town we found was seething with excitement, crowded with visitors from as far as 50 miles around, on account of what was to take place the following day. We asked questions as ignorant wandering peddlers and were answered readily enough. What we learned was horrifying. The day was called by different names. Some spoke of the hunt, others of Execution Day. In my native England, murderers were hanged, a brutal and disgusting thing, but one which was thought necessary to protect the innocent, and which was carried out expeditiously and as humanely as such a practice could be. Here, instead, they were kept in prison, until one day in the autumn, when the grapes were in and pressed and first new wine ready, then a tripod came, and one by one the condemned were turned loose, and the tripod hunted them, while the townspeople watched and drank wine and cheered the sight. Tomorrow there were 4 to be hunted and killed, a greater number than there had been for several years. On that account the excitement was the greater. The new wine would not be served until the day, but there was old wine enough and a good deal of drunkenness as they slaked their thirsts and nursed their feverish anticipations. I turned from the sight sickened and said to Fritz, "At least we can leave at daybreak. We do not have to stay and watch what happens." He looked at me calmly. "But we must, Bill." "Watch a man, whatever his crime, sent out for a tripod to course him like a hare, while his fellow men make wagers on the time he will last?" I was angry and showed it. "I do not call that an entertainment." "Nor do I. But anything which concerns the tripods is important. It is as it was when we were in the city together. Nothing must be overlooked." "Oh, you do it then. I'll go on the next halt and wait for you there." "No." He spoke tolerantly but firmly. "We were instructed to work together. Besides, between here and the next village, Max might put his foot in a hole and throw me, and I might break my neck in the fall." Max and Moritz were the names he had given the 2 donkeys, after characters in certain stories that German boys were told in their childhood. We both smiled at the thought of the sure-footed Max putting a foot wrong, but I realized that there was a lot in what Fritz said. Witnessing the scene was part of our job, and not to be shirked on account of unpleasantness. "All right," I said, "but we move on the moment it's over. I don't want to stay in this town any longer than I must." He looked around the cafe in which we were sitting. Men sang drunkenly and banged their glasses on the wooden tables, spilling wine. Fritz nodded. I neither. The tripod came during the night. In the morning it stood in a field just below the town, silent, motionless, as those other tripods had stood at the tournament of the Rouge and the games field. This was a day of festival. Flags were flown, lines of bunting ran from roof to roof across the narrow streets, and street traders were out early, selling hot sausages, sweetmeats, sandwiches of chopped raw meat and onion, ribbons and trinkets. I looked at a tray one man was carrying. It contained a dozen or more little wooden tripods, each holding in its tentacle the tiny, agonized figure of a man. The trader was a cheerful, red-faced man, and I saw another as kindly-looking, a prosperous-gated farmer with a bushy white beard, buy two of them for his twin grandchildren, a flaxen-headed boy and a pigtailed girl of 6 or 7. There was much competition for the good vantage points. I did not feel like pressing for one, but Fritz had already fixed things. Many householders whose windows looked down from the town rented space at them, and he had bought places for us. The charge was high, but it included free wine and sausages. It also included the use of magnifying glasses. I had seen a shop window full of these and had gathered that this was a centre for their manufacture. I had wondered why, at the time, not understanding the connection. I knew now. We looked out over the heads of a crowd with the sunlight glinting from a great number of lenses. Not far away, where a road ran steeply downhill, a man had set up a telescope on a stand. It was at least 6 feet long, and he was shouting, "Genuine close-up views, 50 groschen for 10 seconds. 10 shillings for the kill, as close as if he were on the other side of the street." The crowd's frenzy grew with the waiting. Men stood on platforms and took bets as to how long the hunt would last, how far the man would get. This seemed absurd to me at first, for I did not see how he could get any distance at all. But one of the others in the room explained. The man was not sent out on foot, but on horseback. The tripod could easily outdistance the horse, of course, but a horseman getting what advantage he could from the terrain might evade being taken for as long as a quarter of an hour. I asked if anyone ever escaped. My companion shook his head. It was theoretically possible. There was a rule that beyond the river there was no pursuit, but it had never happened in all the years that the hunt had been held. Suddenly the crowd hushed. I saw that a saddled horse was being led into the field above which the tripod loomed. Men in grey uniforms brought along another man, dressed in white. I stared through the glasses and saw that he was a tall, raw-boned man, about 30, who looked lost and bewildered. He was helped to mount the horse and sat there with the uniformed men holding the reins, with the uniformed men holding the stirrups on either side. The hush deepened. Into it came the tolling of the bell of the church clock. As it struck the hour of 9, on the last stroke, they stood back, slapping the horse's flank. The horse bounded forward, and the crowd's voice rose in frenzy. He rode down the slope toward the distant silver gleam of the river. He had gone perhaps a quarter of a mile before the tripod moved. A huge metal foot uprooted itself, arced through the sky, and was followed by another. It was not hurrying particularly. I thought of the man on horseback and felt his fear rise as bile in my own mouth. I looked from the scene to the faces around me. Fritz's was impassive, as usual, intent and observing. The others, they nauseated me. I think more than what was taking place outside. It did not last long. The tripod got him as he galloped across the bare brown slope of a vineyard. The tentacle came down and picked him from the horse with the neatness and sureness of a girl threading a needle. Another cry rose from those who watched. The tentacle held him, a struggling doll, and then a second tentacle. My stomach heaving, I scrambled to my feet and ran from the room. The atmosphere was different when I returned, the feverishness having been replaced by a sort of relaxation. They were drinking wine and talking about the hunt. He had been a poor specimen, they decided. One who appeared to be a senior servant from the estate of a count who had a castle nearby had lost money on him and was indignant about it. My reappearance was greeted with a few mocking remarks and some laughter. They told me I was a weak-bellied foreigner and urged me to have a litre of wine to steady my nerves. Outside, the same relaxation, a sense almost of repletion, could be observed in the crowd. Bets were being paid off, and there was a brisk trade in hot pasties and sweetmeats. The tripod, I noticed, had gone back to its original position in the field. Gradually, as the hour ticked by, tension built up once more. At 10 o'clock, the ceremony repeated itself with the same quickening of the excitement in those about us, the same roar of joy and approval as the hunt began. The second victim gave them better sport. He rode fast and well, and for a time avoided the tripod's tentacle by riding under the cover of trees. When he broke into the open again, I wanted to shout to him to stay where he was. But it would have done no good, as he must have known. The tripod could have plucked the trees out from around him. He was making for the river, and I saw that there was another copse perhaps half a mile farther on. Before he got there, the tentacles swept down. The first time he dodged it, swerving his horse at just the right moment so that the rope of metal flailed down and hit the ground beside him. He had a chance, I thought, of reaching his objective, and the river was not so very much farther on. But the tripod's second attempt was better aimed. He was plucked from the saddle and his body pulled apart, as the first man's had been. In a sudden hush, his cries of agony came thinly to us through the bright autumnal air. I did not come back after that killing. There were limits to what I could stand, even in the course of duty. Fritz stuck it out, but he looked grim when I saw him later and was even more taciturn than usual. A few weeks later we reached the caves. Their gloomy depths were strangely attractive, a haven from the world through which we had journeyed for almost a year. The walls of rock enfolded us and the lamps flickered warmly. More important, though, was the release from the strain of mixing with and dealing with the cat. Here we conversed with free men like ourselves. For 3 days we were idle apart from the ordinary duties in which all shared. Then we had our orders from the local commander, a German whose name was Otto. We were to report in 2 days' time at a place specified only as a point on a map reference. Otto himself did not know why.